Let's go back to 1943. During the Second World War, a factory worker from Birmingham, England, had a new idea for a murder mystery board game. His name was Anthony E. Pratt, and he's responsible for designing Cluedo, or Clue as we know it here in North America. Pratt studied music in his youth and had a career playing concerts in hotels, and these hotels offered entertainment in the form of murder mystery parties. They aren't as common today, but during the first half of the 19th century, they were extremely popular. I won't go into them too much because I think most people know what they are, but if you don't, these are live-acted games similar to live-action roleplay games in which a partygoer gets, quote, murdered, and the attendees of the party have to figure out who did it.
Look everyone over very carefully. Try to figure out who are the real guests and who are actors pretending to be guests.
But times were extremely tough during the war, and people were not able to attend these murder mystery parties as frequently, if at all, and due to the turmoil throughout the 1940s, people didn't have the funds or the will to engage in social activities. Pratt recognized this and decided he wanted to create a game that people could play in the comforts of their own homes, around a table with friends and family. He began to design Cluedo with his wife, Elva, who designed the original artwork for the game's board. He called the game Murder, which was named after a party game he and his friends used to play. In 1944, Pratt applied for a patent. He acquired it in 1947, and not long after, he and his wife presented their creation to Waddington's, a card and board game publisher, and sold them the rights that same year. One of the executives at the company renamed the game to Cluedo, which is supposed to be a play on the word clue, and the game Ludo, which is the Latin word for I play. Post-war shortages delayed the game for a couple years. It wasn't officially launched until 1949, which was also when Parker Brothers purchased the rights for the US publication. They renamed it Clue. Since that is the name I grew up with, I will be referring to the game as Clue more so than Cluedo. Though they have different names, Cluedo and Clue are essentially the same. The only differences have to do with terminology, though there were some minor changes made to Pratt's original vision. The game was always one about deduction, though it originally had 10 suspects. You might be familiar with the most common set of 6: Miss Scarlet, Professor Plum, Reverend Green or Mr. Green in America, Mrs. Peacock, Colonel Mustard, who was originally named Colonel Yellow, and Mrs. White, who was originally named Nurse White. The eliminated were Mrs. Silver, Mr. Brown, Mr. Gold, and Miss Gray, and the remaining character, Dr. Black or Mr. Body in America, was turned into the non-playable host of the mansion and the victim of every game. Though these characters never really made a comeback, in Clue Master Detective there were 4 additional suspects: Sergeant Gray, Madame Rose, Miss Peach, and Monsieur Brunette. There were also 11 rooms in Pratt's original vision. The ones we all know are the library, the study, the hall, the ballroom, the kitchen, the dining room, the conservatory, the billiard room, and the lounge. The other 2 rooms were the cellar, which was cut as a playable location, and the gun room, which was cut altogether.
Guns don't solve problems, believe me, I should know.
Well, I say, very progressive, Colonel Mustard. And let's not forget about the weapons, every parent's worst nightmare. Who knows how many mouths and ears and noses these tiny little pieces have been in. By the way, before I show you the weapons from the game, I'd like to point out that this is the version of Clue I grew up on, and will be the one I'm showcasing a lot of. Isn't it great? It just reeks of the 1970s. The weapons were commonly made out of pewter, much like the Monopoly tokens post-World War II, with the exception of the rope, which was originally string but is now commonly plastic. My personal favorite was always the candlestick. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's Clue's fault that I have a fascination with them, and I always seek them out at thrift stores. The weapon set most people are familiar with has the aforementioned candlestick, alongside the lead pipe, the rope, the revolver, the wrench, and the knife. The original prototype had a lot of different weapons on the table: a bomb, syringe, cudgel, fireplace poker, axe, and poison. A few of those weapons came back for different versions. In fact, you can find the poison in a lot of recent iterations. Though some changes were made to Pratt's original design, for about 40 years that classic Clue formula has remained about the same: 6 weapons, 6 suspects, and 9 rooms. And then Hasbro came in, bought both companies, and things got a little weird. Let's take a moment to reflect on the significance of Clue, not just as a board game, but as a media phenomenon that has really solidified its place in pop culture. The board game was so successful, it spawned an overwhelming amount of variations and spin-offs. I'd like to focus more on these spin-offs because I find them more interesting, and to clarify, these are games that are based on Clue and still use the Clue name but have different rules and gameplay. The amount of variations are equally daunting and sometimes incredibly odd, but these games do follow the rules of the original game. Actually, I could be swayed to buy this variant, but still kinda weird. In the 1980s, there were a couple Clue VCR games. They were humorous in nature, campy, and not terribly fun. If you want to try to find one, you can often get them at thrift stores. I'm not convinced they got a lot of play. I own a couple myself, but haven't actually completed a game. I feel like most people just watch the videos because while they were quite bad, they had a certain riffable quality. I do like VHS and DVD games in theory, but it was kind of rare to find a decent one. The biggest mystery here is why not one person in this hour-long movie can act.
Terrific! Now we have 3 wild killers on the loose.
One of my favorite spin-offs as a youngin' was Clue Jr., The Case of the Missing Pet. There's no murder in this game, of course, because these are children, and the game is also for children, but don't let this lack of horrific tragedy deter you. It's genuinely fun, even though George Green looks like he wants to eat me alive. This game mostly uses similar characters, but is very different with how it plays. You go around the board instead of following the small tiles of the original, and it comes with this cute little spyglass for revealing solutions. It's so gosh darn adorable. I recommend this if you want a game to play with your children. I recently bought it for myself because I could not deny myself the nostalgia. It was just too strong. Other spin-offs included A Terribly Boring Television Show, a collection of children's chapter books, I had them all, don't at me, an off-Broadway musical, and of course the very popular comedy mystery movie Clue. But that's not all, no.
No.
There were also a handful of video games for different consoles. The Sega Genesis version of Clue is great, and it has a very similar mechanic to the board game, not to mention brooding and atmospheric music. There are of course a handful of computer games as well. My personal favorite is the 1996 board game FMV game Hybrid released by Hasbro Interactive. Unlike the badly acted VHS tapes that teetered on being a little too goofy for me to enjoy, these performances are more on the serious side and have better plots.
Now get out before I throw you out.
That's right, buddy. First steal my ideas, and then threaten me. That's about your level, isn't it, eh? Hey? I'll show you what I think of your patent.
Even though the previous companies did release a lot of these spin-offs under the Parker Brothers names, it wasn't until Hasbro acquired the franchise that we started seeing all of these weird themed Clue games, and not long after they started changing up the rules, adding new elements like more suspects, weapons, and settings, and people didn't really like it. In 2008, Clue got a pretty dramatic makeover. It was called Clue Discover the Secrets, and the rooms of the mansion were modernized with the inclusion of the spa and the theater. Some of the characters were changed as well. The Colonel was made into a former football player, and Professor Plum became a rich video game designer. Obviously, Hasbro found Clue outdated and wanted kids to grow up on something that felt more present day, but I don't think that's the main reason it was criticized. We've been subjected to character and board game design changes since the game was launched. I think people were more upset at the added and changed rules because they strayed pretty far, in all honesty. So in 2012, Hasbro went back to the version that was closer to Pratt's, though there were still some changes in terms of board and character design. These are the character designs from the 2013 edition. Oh, Mustard, such a dude bro. The board also went through some changes. It has updated rooms like the garage and the living room, and if you flip it over, it's a lovely beach scene. Welcome to Clue, Millennial Edition. In 2016, Hasbro released an edition that removed Mrs. White and replaced her with a new character, Dr. Orchid, which was met with some resistance, but definitely not the same vitriol as when they changed the formula or added superfluous rules and game elements. That all being said, what exactly is it about Clue that has made it such a force in pop culture? I think think a good place to start in determining why Clue has such an astounding legacy is to go back to the year Anthony Pratt developed it. I've already discussed his fondness for parlor games, but he also had a great love for detective fiction. The genre of crime fiction is fairly new in the grand scheme of things, and the handful of subgenres are even newer, especially whodunits, detective fiction, and hard-boiled mysteries. Even though Sherlock Holmes, the consulting detective created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, was already a successful character, and even though this game isn't necessarily about a detective character at all, it's clear he had some influence. When it launched, Clue was marketed as the great new detective game. For a brief time in the 1950s, there was an obvious Sherlock Holmes character on the front of the box, and though he wasn't specifically called Sherlock Holmes, it's him, clearly. It makes sense to want to use him as a spearhead of sorts. Sherlock Holmes was known for solving crime using deduction, and that is the strategy you use for winning Clue. This advertising is misleading though, as you the player don't play as Sherlock Holmes or really any named detective at all, though I do understand wanting to make the player feel like a famous mystery solver. The advertisement didn't last long, but the fact that the character already had some notoriety, especially in England, and murder mystery in general had really been ramping up between the 1920s and 1940s are big reasons as to why we embraced Clue. Just a few years before Pratt and his wife started designing Clue, crime queen Agatha Christie wrote what many believe to be her best work, And Then There Were None. This book was wildly successful, and it sparked a huge interest in the murder mystery genre. Its influence can definitely be seen in the game, especially in Pratt's original vision before the number of weapons and characters were pared down. The fact that the murders take place in a secluded area, in a mansion, is one of the biggest comparisons you can make to the book, but I think the original weapons and characters make it even more obvious. You may recall Pratt's prototype had 10 characters, just like the book had 10 victims, and the original weapons like the poison, the syringe, and the axe, as well as weapons that stuck around like the rope and the gun, were the murder weapons used in the book. For some reason, Pratt omitted the marble clock in the shape of a bear weapon. Can't imagine why. In 1942, just a year before Pratt and his wife started designing Clue, the Agatha Christie book, The Body in the Library, came out. And I don't think I have to explain this one's influence, it's pretty blatant. The 40s and 50s also saw the rise of film noir mysteries, The Maltese Falcon, The Big Sleep, and The Big Heat, just to name a few. Due to the people's interest in film noir and crime fiction, it was the perfect time to release a detective game, especially since it was the only one of its kind at the time. I think a big reason as to why Clue has stayed so near and dear to our hearts is because of the 1985 movie featuring an all-star cast. The suspects in this game have always had small biographies. For example, Miss Scarlet has always been portrayed as a femme fatale, a popular trope in noir mysteries, and Professor Plum has always been looked at as a quirky, nerdy scientist type. The movie gave us more fully realized characters. Not all of them fit their board game counterparts to a T. Mrs. White, instead of being portrayed as the beleaguered maid, is now a fellow guest and is portrayed as a Black Widow archetype.
I hated her so much. Flames on the side of my face, heaving breaths.
The character names from the game now serve as aliases to align with the film's plot. Despite these differences, the movie is undoubtedly a Clue movie as opposed to just a mystery comedy. It uses the weapon set, the rooms, the setting of the ominous-looking mansion is perfect, and it's just really funny. I'd say this is one of the better Clue spin-offs that really has regenerated a new interest in the franchise itself, even though it initially bombed at the box office.
Oh, how disgusting.
Roger Ebert gave the film 2 out of 4 stars, saying, "The screenplay is so very, very thin that the actors spend most of their time looking frustrated, as though they've been cut off right before they were about to say something interesting." I think that's a strange thing to hear today because this is one of the most quotable movies I've ever seen, and I think the characters are constantly spouting interesting, rapid-fire lines.
There's no need to shout.
I'm not shouting! All right, I am! I'm shouting!
Maybe this is what initiated my interest in candlesticks. I don't know, I just really like them, and it's most definitely not due to sinister reasons. For such a simple game, Clue has stuck around for a really long time, and it continues to inspire more spin-offs and variations than we know what to do with. In fact, I would say that Clue and its classic formula doesn't appeal to as many people anymore, especially in a digital age. But the fact that people have reacted so poorly to Hasbro's attempts to change it to something more relevant means we still hold on to that classic formula, whether we play it or not. It's become more of a product of nostalgia these days, but every now and then I'll get the itch to play a game or two. But even more so, I think I enjoy the wake of spin-offs and variations even more. The movie, the books, and especially the computer games. I still play my FMV Clue game every now and then, and had I not been a fan of the original board games or the movie, I probably wouldn't have given it a second glance. I think this franchise has an interesting history, and even if you've never played the original board game, there's no doubt you've at least heard of or come across something that bears the Clue name, and with new variations still coming out, I don't see it disappearing into obscurity anytime soon. And if you haven't heard of it, then geez, get a clue. Hey everyone, thanks for watching this video. If you're interested in more murder mystery videos, check out my last episode of Murder She Vlogged. If you want to fund this series, do check out my Patreon campaign. And if you want to give me suggestions on topics for the future, hit me up on my social media pages. As always, I'll see you guys in the next one.